and I'll be the session moderator, and I'm also the first speaker. So I'll just start. What I'd like to talk about today is a process for capturing subregional variability in regional scale climate change vulnerability assessments. And this is work that was done during the Northern Rockies Adaptation Partnership, NRAP, which is the session going on concurrently in another room right now. And I'd like to acknowledge Kevin McKelvey and Dave Peterson and Jeff Hickey, who are all really equal contributors to this work. The funding for this, for myself, this was a chapter in my dissertation, and it was funded from the Northwest Climate Science Center with a graduate fellowship. And most of Kevin and Dave's funding has come from the Forest Service, either the Pacific Research Station or the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and Office of the Climate Change Advisor. And I'd also really like to thank Jessica Hilofsky, who is in the other room right now, and Lin Huang, who was the Forest Service leader of this whole project. So, we all know that in one way or another, climate has an influence on the natural resources, whether that's in plant distribution or phenology or the timing, as we've heard about today, of snow and snowpack duration and snow melt and the persistence of ephemeral water sources on the landscape. But we also know that climate is changing, and we can't always look to the past for an adequate prediction of what the future might hold. So we need a process for evaluating what are the climate vulnerabilities so that we can manage our natural resources to the best of our ability. So the process that the whole framework that I'll be talking about this in, really following what was laid out by Glick and others in Scanning the Conservation Horizon. And they start with saying there are really 4 major steps of this process. First is determining the scope, what it is you're going to focus on. Next is gathering the information that you need that exists or that you are in the process of collecting through original research. Then assessing the components of vulnerability, and then using that information, using that assessment in planning and management applications. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time talking about the components of vulnerability, because there are a lot of definitions out there about what is vulnerability and how do we measure it, how do we define it. And so the way they laid it out was you have exposure and sensitivity, which together define the potential impact on the resource. Then along with adaptive capacity, that defines the vulnerability. But just some further definition, exposure is, in this context, the degree of change that is expected. And what I think is important here is it's the degree of change in the physical climate, but it's also the degree of change in the indirect effects that that change in climate causes. And that's really an important part to remember. Then sensitivity can be thought of, or what is the response to those changes in the system or the organism that you're interested in. And adaptive capacity is the ability to reduce or moderate or escape those changes. So back to NRAP, the Northern Rockies Adaptation Partnership. This was the largest geographic scale vulnerability assessment that had been conducted in the United States to date, and it was led by the Forest Service out of Region 1. And then it grew to, which covers northern Idaho, all of Montana, and into the Dakotas. And then it expanded to include national parks, Glacier National Park and Yellowstone Park, and some additional Forest Service land that is in Region 4 in the greater Yellowstone, as well as BLM lands. And then it also included partners from NGOs and tribal governments, and that's a pretty inclusive list. So I'd like to just show you the process. How was NRAP set up to work? So it started at the regional level, where a team decided what the species and the resources that would be focused on. So this is the scope. What will be covered in this assessment? Then the gathering of the information stage, a draft vulnerability assessment was compiled. Then that was sent to the subregions, And there were 5 different subregions, which I'll go back to that map in a few minutes and show you more specifically where they are. There were workshops in each of these regions to do 2 main things. One was to capture the subregional variability in vulnerability that was described in the regional assessment. And the second was to develop adaptation strategies and tactics. And the strategies were sort of the bigger picture. We want to maintain aspen resilience, as an example. And a tactic would be, we're going to transplant beaver to this drainage because we think that will help. So that was the second major goal. Then that information was taken back at the regional level and synthesized, incorporated into the vulnerability assessment, sent back to the subregions for review. And now most of those chapters are under peer review right now, and then it'll be published as a final GTR, General Technical Report. So what I'm going to talk about today is the process of capturing subregional variability. How is each region different from what was described as the whole across how subregion different from the whole region? So to do this, we started with that framework that laid out by Glick et al., looking at exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. We developed a questionnaire to be answered at those workshops. Then through facilitated discussions at each of the workshops, going through that questionnaire, and we took those responses back, interpreting them in light of that framework, and just say we had to iterate on that because it wasn't quite right the first time. So the questionnaire was designed to capture 2 main categories of information. One is what was missing from the regional vulnerability assessment, or what, from the subregion point of view, was missing from the scope of the process. And then second, how are the components of vulnerability different in each subregion? And again, we were looking at this in terms of exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, all influencing vulnerability. So back to this map, there were 5 subregions, and in the western part is the western subregion, northern Idaho. Then the central, which was Missoula, that area up north through Glacier Park. The east region, which was centered around Helena. Then the GYA, Greater Yellowstone area. And then all of eastern Montana and North Dakota, the grassland region. So in each workshop, the participants were first given a summary of what was in the draft assessment, and then broke into specific resource groups. There was wildlife and fisheries, forested vegetation, non-forested, recreation, ecosystem services, and then disturbance, just sort of fit in multiple places. And at each workshop there was a discussion facilitator, and that tended to be fairly consistent. Kevin McKelvey was the wildlife facilitator for 4 out of those 5 workshops, and that was each group had a pretty consistent discussion leader and then a note taker, so that the people who were there sharing their information didn't have to worry about keeping track of it all. So for the rest of this, I'm only going to focus on the wildlife group because it's too much to try and cover all of it. So now we look at what do we find? What did people have to say? And what information was missing from the regional vulnerability assessment? These are the wildlife species that the regional level team decided that would be included in the draft assessment. And these are the species that in some region, one subregion or another, were important, according to the people who were participating in the workshop. So you can see there's some overlap, which was nice, but there's also a lot of species that were important to individuals and to groups in those subregions that simply weren't covered. And this created some interesting dilemmas about how to proceed, because at the first workshop, I think we added 6 or 7 species. And then at the next workshop, there were a few more added, and then the next one, there were a few more added. So no one had the ability to actually assess the same set of species. So we couldn't rank and say, well, how important are links across this whole region? Because one, there wasn't time to do that, and two, that species might not have been added might have been added at a workshop that came after theirs. And so it made things a little bit confusing. And that led us to our first recommendation for improving this process. And that is, instead of compiling a draft vulnerability assessment, it should first go to review at the subregion so they can say, we'd like Townsend's big-eared bat, please. And, well, we don't really care about pika because, yes, they're vulnerable to climate change, but we don't feel there are any management tactics that we could do anything about. So we don't want to spend our time focusing on something that we can't do anything about. Next, interpretation of response is, well, what does the variability look like in vulnerability across subregions? Looks like a mess. Quite honestly, it was a mess. The discussions were that people, and not because people didn't have ideas and know about their species in their subregion, but because it's really hard to, if you heard Kevin's talk this morning, it's not, wildlife in particular, it's not a linear increase in temperature, therefore this effect on any given population or individual. And so it took some time to sort through all those responses. It took some time in the workshops to figure out how to get at what was really important. And what we realized is, well, the framework that we set up didn't really work. That's not how people were thinking about vulnerability. And so we found a different framework that made more sense. It was easier to interpret what people had said if we thought of climate change as having multiple pathways. And there are direct physiological influences, and then there are indirect pathways of influence. And just some of the examples that came up from the wildlife group were human influence. Climate change may affect people's decisions about energy development, it may affect their decisions about residential development, and that can have an effect on wildlife. Climate can affect habitat by a whole previous indirect pathway of effects on the vegetation. It can affect connectivity directly if they're snow-dependent species and you need to move through snow-covered areas only. It can have indirect effects on connectivity. Disease transmission and occurrence is another one that is an indirect, and interspecific interactions. How will it change the competitive abilities, not the abilities, but the competitive hierarchy among species, and predator-prey interactions. And each of these pathways have their own exposure and sensitivity. Because remember, exposure is not just what's the change in the physical climate, it's what do the changes in the physical climate induce in other aspects. And so I only list it here under direct physiological just for room, but it was really hard to say when we were looking at people's responses, like, well, is that exposure or is that sensitivity? But when we turned it into the pathways first, then it was much easier to categorize and say, right, well, that's exposure in habitat change. That's sensitivity in sensitivity to habitat. So then all of these pathways interact with what participants tended to describe as population characteristics. And this is adaptive capacity. It's a different word, but it's the same idea. It's what's the population size? What's the genetic structure? Where is it in the environmental niche? Is it a population at the edge of its range? Is it a population in the middle? And all of those ultimately lead to what people thought of as population effects, which is vulnerability. So once we did this, then we could start actually making some comparisons across regions, because it was impossible at first to say, well, I don't know, everything's different. They're all different from each other in one way or another. So this is looking at those indirect pathways of climate change. And the 5 regions, again, the Greater Yellowstone, the GYA, the West, Central, East, and Grasslands. And if you look at the blue, that's connectivity. And that was really important to the wildlife group in the eastern subregion, which makes sense. This is a part of the state where there are mountain island ranges surrounded by vast valleys, grasslands, and so connectivity is a big deal there. It wasn't mentioned at all in this area, in the Coeur d'Alene area. It's not considered important here. And so another example of how this helped us think and make sense of what was said in terms of the difference between exposure and sensitivity is ruffed grouse. They were actually discussed in several subregions, and in the greater Yellowstone, people said, well, we're concerned about ruffed grouse because they're aspen obligates, and if there's climate change that's influencing aspen health and aspen potential for future aspen on the landscape, then that's a big deal. We need to be concerned with managing aspen. Then we came to the workshop in Missoula, and they said, no way, grouse, they're everywhere here. They're not aspen obligates. They're in the spruce fir. Ruffed grouse are everywhere. So it's a difference in sensitivity and exposure, because that indirect pathway of habitat operates very differently on the same species in a different region. So it was we've sort of muddled through part of this, quite honestly, but I feel like we really learned a lot from it. And hopefully, the goal of this is to learn and share what worked and what did not work. And then so hopefully the next time someone's doing this, they can say, well, we'll try it that way to begin with because we know what didn't work. So just to summarize, what we found from this is, involve the subregions right away. Saves time throughout the whole process. And second, instead of going right to exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, think about what those different pathways of climate change look like. And then how can you break those down into exposure and sensitivity to work through adaptive capacity to then define vulnerability. So hopefully that, I know the Forest Service, Dave Peterson's doing this in Region 4, and hopefully it goes a little bit better the next time, because we feel like we learned a little bit of something about how to conduct the process. Because the people, if you've been on the ground, if you've been a field person at all, you know that the people on the ground know a ton. But it's hard to figure out how to get that information out and make sense of it all. And so that's our little contribution for one way to make it better. So thanks, and I think I have a few minutes for questions. Okay, Ari.
How do you feel you've chosen the regions? Would you redraw them?
Yeah, so the question was, how were the regions chosen, the subregions, and would those be redrawn? And, there are a lot of ways to do that. And Kevin, correct me if you know how this was done differently. Yeah, they do seem to pretty much encapsulate different ecological and climatological parts of that whole area. Like the greater Yellowstone, people there tend to think of that as its own place, but it is somewhat arbitrary. It has to be, because it's all, the difference between northern Montana and southern Montana is a slow gradation. Okay, next.